My grandson said he'd handle my taxes online. The IRS refund went somewhere else. My grandson offered to file my taxes online, so you don't have to deal with all that paperwork, Grandpa. I was grateful. Then the IRS letter came. My refund had been deposited months ago, into an account that wasn't mine. He hadn't filed my taxes. He'd quietly rerouted them. I'm truly grateful you're here with me right now, whoever you are, wherever you're watching from. Before this story starts to unfold in front of you, let me ask you something simple. Where are you watching from tonight? Tell me in the comments what town, what country you're listening from, whether you're folding laundry, driving home, or lying awake the way a lot of us do, once we've spent a whole life trusting the people closest to us, only to find out how easily that trust can be turned against us. Before we go on, leave me a comment. Just tell me where you're listening from, which town, which country. One more thing before we really begin. Some details in this story have been fictionalized for the sake of clarity and emotional weight. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. But the lesson you're about to hear, that part is real. As real as the columns I balanced by hand for 38 years of my working life. Now, let's begin. My name is Harold Whitfield. I'm 74 years old, and for 38 years I worked as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing plant on the east side of Erie, Pennsylvania. The kind of job where a man learns to trust numbers more than he trusts most people, because numbers, if you're careful with them, never lie to you. I spent my whole career making sure every column added up. Every discrepancy got tracked down to its source, and every dollar that passed through my hands was accounted for honestly, down to the penny. My hands, the same hands that once balanced ledgers to the penny every single month without fail, never imagined they'd one day have to hold an IRS letter that told me my own tax refund, money I'd been counting on to fix the roof over my head, had already been sent somewhere I'd never authorized, into an account that had nothing to do with me. Dorothy. To understand the weight of what I'm about to tell you, I need to first tell you about Dorothy, my wife, who passed away 6 years ago after a long fight with emphysema, a disease that took its time with her, but never once stole her dignity, not even at the very end. I met Dorothy in the fall of 1971, at a church social not far from where I'd grown up, on the east side of Erie. She was working as a receptionist at a dentist's office back then, and I was a young man just starting out at the plant, still learning how to keep a ledger balanced without my supervisor looking over my shoulder every 5 minutes. We got married 2 years later in a small Lutheran church my family had attended for 3 generations, and for 44 years we built a life together out of careful budgets, modest vacations, and a house on Poplar Street that I painted myself every 8 years or so, whether it needed it or not, just because Dorothy liked the way it looked fresh. We had one daughter, Diane, who's 46 now and lives about 20 minutes away with her husband. Diane never had much head for numbers the way I did. She went into nursing instead, which suited her a lot better than accounting ever would have. But she gave us something far more precious than a shared profession. She gave us Tyler, our grandson, who's 23 now, and who I raised almost as much as Diane did, especially after his father left when Tyler was still in grade school. When Dorothy got sick, 5 years before she passed, Tyler was still just a teenager, but he started coming around more, helping me carry groceries, mowing the lawn on weekends, sitting with his grandmother while I ran errands. It was in those years of him being present, of him being useful and kind in all the small ways a grandson can be, that I built up a trust in him that I considered, right up until a few months ago, about as solid and unshakable as anything in my life. The house on Poplar Street. The house I still live in is a modest 2-story clapboard on Poplar Street, the same house Dorothy and I bought in 1976, with a mortgage that took us 17 years of careful budgeting to pay off. It's not a fancy house, never was, but every room in it carries the weight of our whole life together. The kitchen where Dorothy taught Diane to bake, the small back bedroom that became Tyler's whenever he stayed over, the porch where I still sit most evenings now, watching the same street I've watched for almost 50 years. After Dorothy passed, the house started to feel too big and too quiet for one man to rattle around in alone, and the upkeep, the roof, the furnace, the plumbing that's original to the house in more places than I'd like to admit, started weighing on me in a way it never had when there were 2 of us splitting the worry. My pension from the plant, combined with Social Security, covers the basics well enough, but any big repair still requires careful saving, the same kind of patient budgeting I practiced for 38 years at my desk. That's exactly why, when tax season rolled around this past year, and Tyler, home from his junior year of college, where he's studying accounting of all things, offered to handle my taxes online, I felt nothing but gratitude. "Grandpa, you shouldn't have to deal with all that paperwork every year," he told me over dinner one Sunday. "Let me do it electronically. It's faster, and honestly, you might even get your refund back quicker than if you mail in the old paper forms." I had always filed my taxes myself, by hand, the old-fashioned way, the same way I'd balanced every ledger of my working life. But I was 73 years old, my eyes weren't what they used to be, and the idea of my own grandson, a young man studying the very subject that had been my life's work, taking that burden off my shoulders felt like exactly the kind of family support a man my age should be grateful to receive. I never imagined, sitting there at that Sunday dinner table, how far that gratitude would end up costing me. Handing over the paperwork. A week or so after that Sunday dinner, Tyler came by the house with his laptop, and I gathered up everything he said he'd need. My Social Security number, my pension statement, my W-2 information from the small part-time bookkeeping consulting work I still picked up occasionally for a couple of local businesses, and my bank account and routing numbers for First Erie Community Bank, where I'd kept my accounts for over 40 years. "This'll take me 20 minutes tops," Tyler said, tapping away at his keyboard while I sat across from him at the kitchen table, half proud and half bewildered by how quickly he moved through screens I would have spent an hour squinting at. "I'll set it up so your refund goes straight into your checking account, same as always. You don't have to do a thing." I thanked him, made him a cup of coffee, and thought nothing more of it for weeks. Tax season came and went. I assumed, the way you assume the sun will come up, that everything had been handled exactly the way Tyler said it would be. It was around that time that I mentioned the arrangement to Verna Hutchins, a widow who's lived 2 doors down from me for almost 30 years, and who's become, since Dorothy passed, about the closest thing I have to a confidant outside of my own family. Verna and I take our evening walks together most nights, weather permitting, along the same stretch of Poplar Street we've walked for decades. "Harold," she said when I told her Tyler was handling my taxes electronically this year, "you gave him your Social Security number and your bank account information. Did you see the final return before he submitted it? Or did you just hand it all over and trust him to take care of everything?" I admitted, a little sheepishly, that I hadn't looked at a single screen before he hit submit. Verna didn't say anything more that evening, but I remember the look on her face, a look I understand so much better now than I did at the time, the look of someone who's seen a particular kind of trouble before and recognized its shape before anyone else in the room. The letter from the IRS. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late August, months after tax season had ended, when I found an envelope in my mailbox with the unmistakable return address of the Internal Revenue Service. My stomach did a small, uneasy flip before I even opened it. Nobody my age gets a good feeling seeing that particular envelope waiting for them. But I told myself it was probably just some routine notice, a correction, a minor adjustment, nothing to lose sleep over. I opened it, standing right there at the mailbox, and read the first few lines twice before the words actually settled into meaning. The letter stated in the flat, bureaucratic language these things always use, that my federal tax refund in the amount of $3,140 had been successfully direct deposited on April the 11th, nearly 4 months earlier, into the bank account ending in the digits 4722. I don't have an account ending in 4722. I've had the same checking account at First Erie Community Bank for over 40 years, and I know every single digit of it the way I know my own birthday. I stood there on my own front walk, the letter shaking slightly in my hands, feeling a cold, creeping confusion that I hadn't felt since the day the doctors first told us about Dorothy's diagnosis. Someone had filed a tax return under my name, using my Social Security number, and directed a refund I never received into an account that belonged to somebody else entirely. And the only person who had had access to all of that information, my Social Security number, my W-2, my bank details, every piece of paper Tyler had gathered from my kitchen table that Sunday afternoon, was my own grandson. I'm still here. Before I keep going with this story, I want to stop for a moment with you, whoever you are on the other side of the screen. I know what I'm about to tell you touches on something a lot of us carry quietly, especially those of us who've spent a lifetime handing over trust to the people we love. The fear of discovering that the very person we raised, the one we trusted to help us with, something as ordinary as paperwork, might have used that trust to take something from us instead. If you've ever handed a family member your personal information, your account numbers, your social security number, believing it was simply an act of love and convenience, I want you to know that trusting them was never a weakness. It's what love looks like. It deserves respect, not betrayal. I'm still here. Stay with me. If you're still here, on the other side of the screen, write it to me in the comments. I'm here. Because what I was about to uncover, standing there on my own front walk with that letter still shaking in my hands, was going to test not just my trust in my own grandson, but my ability at 74 years old to face a truth I never wanted to believe about the boy I helped raise. Calling the IRS. I didn't call Tyler that afternoon. 38 years of balancing ledgers had taught me one lesson above all others. Never act on a suspicion before you've confirmed the numbers, because numbers, unlike people, will always tell you the truth if you have the patience to look at them carefully enough. If I confronted Tyler based on nothing but a letter and a bad feeling, and there turned out to be some innocent explanation, a clerical error at the bank, a mistake on the IRS's end, I risked damaging something in our relationship that could never fully be repaired over a misunderstanding. So instead, I called the IRS directly the next morning, sitting at my kitchen table with the letter spread out in front of me and a legal pad ready for notes, the same way I used to prepare for an audit at the plant. After nearly 90 minutes on hold, I finally reached a representative who confirmed what the letter had said. A return had indeed been filed under my social security number back in early April, and the refund had been successfully deposited into an account that did not match any account on file from my previous year's filings. "Sir," the representative told me, her voice carefully neutral in the way I imagine they're trained to be, "this pattern, a legitimate return filed with accurate income information, but with altered direct deposit details, is something we do see, unfortunately, particularly in cases involving identity theft by someone with close access to the taxpayer's personal information. I'd recommend filing an identity theft affidavit, Form 14039, as soon as possible, and reaching out to your bank to flag your accounts for additional monitoring." She explained that whoever had filed my return had used my real income information, meaning they hadn't just made up numbers out of thin air, which would have raised red flags with the IRS's own fraud detection systems, but had simply changed one crucial field, the direct deposit account number where the refund would land. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the simplest and most devastating kinds of fraud I could imagine, precisely because it required real, accurate information that only someone I trusted completely could have gotten from me. I hung up the phone and sat at that kitchen table for a long time, staring at the legal pad in front of me, filled with the same careful handwriting I'd used for 4 decades of bookkeeping, now recording the unraveling of my own family's trust instead of a company's quarterly figures. Attorney Patricia Nolan. On Verna's recommendation, she'd used the same attorney years earlier when settling her late husband's estate. I made an appointment with Patricia Nolan, an elder law attorney with a small practice not far from downtown Erie, who specializes in exactly the kind of situation I now found myself in. Financial exploitation of older adults, often as she put it during our first meeting, by the very people closest to them, which is precisely what makes it so hard for families to recognize, let alone prosecute. Attorney Nolan reviewed the IRS letter, my notes from the phone call, and asked me detailed questions about exactly what I'd given Tyler and when. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "what you're describing has a specific pattern to it that I've unfortunately seen before. Someone with access to your accurate tax information filed a legitimate return, but rerouted the deposit. This isn't a random hacker working off information bought on some corner of the internet. This is someone who had your actual paperwork in their hands." She explained that Pennsylvania, like many states, has specific statutes covering financial exploitation of older adults, statutes that treat this kind of theft, especially when committed by a family member in a position of trust, as an aggravated offense carrying more serious penalties than ordinary theft, precisely because it exploits a relationship of care and dependency. Before we go further, she told me, I want you to request a full transcript of the return that was filed under your name from the IRS. That transcript will show us exactly what account and routing numbers were used for the deposit. Once we have that, we can work with local law enforcement to trace that account back to whoever actually controls it. I left her office that afternoon with a folder of instructions, a referral to file a police report with the Erie Police Department, and a growing, sinking certainty in my stomach that I already knew, deep down, whose name would eventually be attached to that account number, even though some small, stubborn part of me kept hoping I was wrong. The transcript. It took nearly 3 weeks for the IRS to process my request and mail out the wage and income transcript, along with the return transcript showing exactly what had been filed under my Social Security number back in April. When the envelope finally arrived, I sat down at my kitchen table with Verna beside me. She'd insisted on being there when I opened it, and I was grateful for the company more than I let on, and read through every line with the same methodical attention I'd once given to a company's year-end books. The income figures were accurate, almost to the dollar, matching my actual pension statement and my modest consulting income for the year. Whoever filed this return had clearly had access to my genuine paperwork, not just guessed or estimated. But when I got to the section listing the direct deposit information, there it was in black and white, a routing number for Lakeside Credit Union, an institution I had never in my life done business with, and an account number ending in those same digits 4722 that had haunted me since the day that first letter arrived. Harold, Verna said quietly, reading over my shoulder, you need to bring this straight to your attorney and to the police. This isn't a guess anymore. This is proof. I called Attorney Nolan's office that same afternoon, and she confirmed that with this transcript in hand, we now had exactly what was needed to file a formal police report and request that detectives subpoena Lakeside Credit Union for the identity of the account holder tied to that voting and account number. It was, she told me, the kind of paper trail that makes these cases winnable, when so many elder financial exploitation cases fall apart for lack of exactly this kind of documentation. I remember sitting in my car outside her office afterward, engine off, just staring at that transcript in my lap, thinking about how many hours I'd spent over the decades teaching Tyler how numbers work, how a ledger has to balance, how every dollar has to be accounted for somewhere. I never imagined I'd be using that same lifelong discipline to trace the theft of my own money back to the very boy I'd taught it to, Detective Kowalski. I filed a formal report with the Erie Police Department the following week, and the case was assigned to Detective Frank Kowalski, a heavy-set man in his 50s, with the kind of patient, unhurried manner that put me at ease almost immediately, even as the subject matter of our conversation made my stomach turn. He had spent nearly 2 decades on the force, much of it working cases involving fraud and financial crimes, and something in the calm, methodical way he took notes reminded me, oddly enough, of my own approach to a set of books that didn't quite balance. Mr. Whitfield, he told me during our first meeting at the station, I want you to understand something before we go any further. Cases like this, where an elderly victim's own family member is the suspect, are some of the hardest ones we handle, not because the evidence is weak, but because so many victims change their minds halfway through, once they realize what a conviction could actually mean for someone they love. I need to know now, as much as you can tell me. Are you prepared to see this through, wherever it leads? I told him I was, though I confess my voice wavered more than I would have liked when I said it. He nodded, made a note, and explained that with the transcript I'd already obtained, along with my sworn statement about handing Tyler my financial documents for the purpose of filing my taxes, he had more than enough probable cause to request a subpoena for Lakeside Credit Union's account records tied to that routing and account number. The subpoena took just under 2 weeks to process. When Detective Kowalski called me back into his office to share what they'd found, I could see in his expression that he already knew this news wasn't going to be easy for me to hear, even though some part of me had been bracing for it since the moment that first IRS letter landed in my mailbox. Mr. Whitfield, he said, sliding a printed document across his desk toward me. The account ending in 4722 at Lakeside Credit Union is registered to a Tyler Marsh, date of birth matching your grandson's. I sat there in that small municipal office, looking down at my own grandson's full legal name printed on a bank subpoena response, and felt something inside me quietly, finally, break. What drove him to? Detective Kowalski explained that, before pursuing formal charges, his department would need to establish motive and pattern, both to strengthen the case and to determine whether this was an isolated act or part of a broader scheme. With a follow-up subpoena for Tyler's own banking activity over the preceding year, a much darker picture began to emerge than a single act of desperate greed. Tyler, it turned out, had accumulated significant debt over the past 18 months through an online sports betting app, the kind that had become almost impossible to avoid advertising during football season, promising easy money and instant deposits to anyone with a smartphone and a checking account. What started, according to records, the detective was able to piece together, as small weekend wagers during his sophomore year of college had escalated steadily into a compulsive pattern of larger and larger bets, chasing losses that kept multiplying faster than his part-time campus job could ever hope to cover. By the time tax season rolled around this past spring, Tyler owed several $1,000s across 2 different betting platforms, debts he had apparently been too ashamed to admit to his mother, to me, or to anyone else in the family. My tax refund, modest by most standards, but substantial to a young man drowning in gambling debt, must have looked to him in that moment like the only quiet, no questions asked solution available. This wasn't a one-time impulsive decision, Mr. Whitfield, Detective Kowalski told me, laying out bank statements showing repeated deposits into betting platforms stretching back well over a year. The offer to handle your taxes for you and the choice to reroute the refund instead of simply telling you he needed help suggests a level of planning that goes well beyond someone caught in one bad moment. He needed a source of cash that wouldn't immediately raise questions from you, and your tax refund gave him exactly that. Sitting in that office, looking at printouts of my own grandson's gambling losses stacking up month after month, I understood for the first time just how much shame and desperation had been hiding behind the easy, confident young man who'd sat across my kitchen table, tapping away at his laptop, telling me not to worry about a thing. Confronting Tyler. Before formal charges were filed, I asked Detective Kowalski if I could speak with Tyler myself, just once, before the legal process took its course. He advised caution, reminding me that anything Tyler said to me could potentially be used in the investigation, but he understood, I think, that a grandfather needed to look his grandson in the eye at least one time before letting the system take over. I invited Tyler to the house on a Thursday evening, telling him only that I needed to talk to him about something important. He arrived looking tired in a way I hadn't noticed before, dark circles under his eyes that I'd chalked up to college stress rather than the weight of an 18-month secret finally catching up to him. "Tyler," I said, once we were both seated at the same kitchen table where he'd filed that return months earlier, "I know about the account at Lakeside Credit Union. I know my refund went there instead of to me. I need you to tell me the truth." I watched the color drain from his face, watched the easy confidence he'd always carried crumble in front of me in a matter of seconds. "Grandpa," he said, his voice cracking, "I was going to pay you back. I swear I was. I just needed time. I got into some trouble with some bets, and it spiraled, and I didn't know how to tell anyone, and when you asked me to file your taxes, I saw a way out, and I took it, and I've hated myself every single day since." "Why didn't you just tell me you needed help?" I asked him, and I meant it as an honest question, not an accusation, though I could hear the hurt bleeding through in my own voice. "I would have found a way to help you, Tyler. I've never once turned you away when you needed something." "I was ashamed," he said, tears running freely now. "You worked your whole life balancing books to the penny. How was I supposed to tell you I'd blown thousands of dollars on some betting app? I thought I could fix it quietly before anyone found out. I never thought it would go this far." I sat with that admission for a long moment, feeling the particular grief of watching someone you love confess to a betrayal instead of asking for help, understanding now that the same shame that had driven him to gamble in secret had also driven him to steal from me in secret, each choice compounding the last until there was no quiet way out left at all. Diane finds out. Telling my daughter what her son had done was, without question, one of the hardest conversations of my life. Harder even than the conversation I'd had with Tyler himself, because I knew it would break something in Diane that no amount of restitution could ever fully repair. The belief that her son was someone incapable of this kind of calculated betrayal. I asked her to come by on a Saturday morning without Tyler and told her everything. The letter, the transcript, the subpoena, the gambling debts, Tyler's own tearful confession at my kitchen table. I watched my daughter's face go through every stage of disbelief, denial, and finally a grief so raw it frightened me a little. The same daughter who'd always been so steady, so practical, the nurse who could handle any crisis at the hospital without flinching. "Dad," she said when she could finally speak again, "how long has this been going on? The gambling, I mean. Was there any sign? Did I miss something as his mother that I should have caught?" I told her honestly that I didn't know the full extent of it, that Detective Kowalski was still piecing together the timeline, but that, from what we understood so far, it had been building for well over a year, hidden carefully from both of us. "Diane," I said, taking her hand across my kitchen table, "you didn't miss anything that either of us should have caught. Shame is good at hiding. Tyler built a wall around this specifically, so neither of us would see it." "What happens now?" she asked, and I could hear in her voice the terrible weight of a mother having to ask that question about her own child, facing possible criminal charges. "Now," I told her, as gently as I could manage, "we let the process do what it's supposed to do. Not because I want to see him punished for the sake of punishment, but because Tyler needs to actually face what he did, honestly, out loud, in front of people who aren't going to let him quietly explain it away. That's the only way any of us come out the other side of this with something worth calling healing." Diane nodded, tears streaming down her face, and for a long while, we simply sat together in silence, two generations of the same family trying to absorb a betrayal that had, in its own way, wounded us both. Charges are filed. Based on the evidence gathered by Detective Kowalski, the IRS transcript, the bank subpoena results, Tyler's own admission during our kitchen table conversation, which he later repeated with counsel present to investigators, the Erie County District Attorney's Office filed charges against Tyler under Pennsylvania's financial exploitation of an older adult statute, along with a separate federal referral to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division regarding the fraudulent filing itself. Assistant District Attorney Rachel Simmons, who was assigned to prosecute the case, met with me twice in the weeks leading up to the preliminary hearing, walking me through exactly what to expect from the legal process. "Mr. Whitfield," she told me during our first meeting, "cases involving a grandchild and grandparent are some of the most emotionally difficult ones our office handles, precisely because so many victims, understandably, want justice and reconciliation at the same time, and those two things don't always move at the same pace." She explained that Tyler's cooperation with investigators, along with his lack of any prior criminal record, would likely factor into sentencing recommendations, but that the state still intended to pursue the case seriously, given the deliberate planning involved and the specific targeting of an elderly family member's financial vulnerability. At the same time, on the federal side, the IRS confirmed through their Identity Theft Resolution Unit that once my Form 14039 affidavit was fully processed alongside the criminal referral, they would move to reissue my original refund directly to me, treating the fraudulently redirected deposit as a matter to be recovered separately from Tyler through the criminal restitution process, rather than making me wait indefinitely for that recovery before I saw a dime of what I was actually owed. "It's going to feel slow," ADA Simmons warned me, "and there will be moments where it feels like the system cares more about procedure than about you. But every piece of documentation you've already gathered, the transcript, the subpoena, your own careful notes, that's exactly what makes this case strong enough to actually go somewhere instead of falling apart the way so many of these cases do when the paper trail isn't there." The hearing. The preliminary hearing took place in the Erie County Courthouse on a gray morning in late autumn, the kind of overcast sky that seemed to match the mood of everyone gathered in that courtroom. I sat beside Attorney Nolan, with Verna in the row behind me for support, while across the aisle Diane sat rigid and pale next to her ex-husband, who had driven up from Pittsburgh for the hearing despite years of limited contact with his son. Tyler appeared with his own court-appointed attorney, since his college savings, ironically, had already been drained partly by his gambling debts and partly by what remained after his own arrest. He looked smaller somehow in that courtroom, dressed in a borrowed blazer that didn't quite fit him, none of the easy confidence from that Sunday dinner table anywhere visible in his posture. A D.A. Simmons presented the evidence methodically, the IRS transcript showing the altered direct deposit information, the bank subpoena confirming the account belonged to Tyler, and a summary of his recorded statement admitting to using my personal financial information to redirect my refund without my knowledge or consent. The judge, a stern but not unkind woman named Judge Eleanor Whitcomb, listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on the papers in front of her. When it came time for Tyler's attorney to respond, he didn't attempt to dispute the facts, which even I found to be a small mercy. Instead, he focused on Tyler's lack of any prior record, his voluntary cooperation with investigators once confronted, and the underlying gambling addiction that, he argued, warranted treatment alongside any criminal penalty rather than treatment as an afterthought. Judge Whitcomb found sufficient evidence to move the case forward to trial, setting bail conditions that included a prohibition on any gambling activity and mandatory enrollment in a certified gambling addiction treatment program as a condition of his release. Watching my own grandson stand there while those conditions were read aloud, I felt a strange mixture of grief and something almost like relief. The relief of watching a problem finally being named out loud instead of continuing to fester in silence the way it had for 18 months before I ever opened that letter from the IRS. The hardest doubt. Before I agreed to fully cooperate with the charges filed against Tyler, I spent several days in an inner turmoil that, even now, I consider among the most difficult stretches of this entire ordeal, perhaps even harder than the moment I first discovered the fraud itself. Because discovering you've been robbed is one thing. Deciding deliberately to put your own grandson through a criminal trial, knowing it could mean prison time, is something else entirely. I spent long nights staring at the ceiling of the bedroom Dorothy and I had shared for over 4 decades, asking myself whether it wouldn't be wiser, more dignified even, to simply let the matter drop, to accept the loss of the refund as a painful but bearable price to avoid dragging Tyler through a court system that could follow him for the rest of his life. I thought about Emily, about how she might have to explain, for years to come, why her brother had a criminal record. I thought, with an irrational guilt that gnawed at me in the darkest hours of the night, about what I might have done differently as a grandfather to prevent Tyler from ever arriving at this decision in the first place. It was Verna, once again, who gave me the perspective I needed during those difficult days. "Harold," she told me one evening, taking both my hands in hers, "if we let this go, what exactly are we teaching Tyler? That he can keep doing this, maybe with even worse consequences down the road, maybe even against Emily one day, if she ever has something he decides he needs? Justice isn't revenge, Harold. It's the natural consequence of a choice your grandson made as a fully grown, responsible adult, not some innocent lapse in judgment." I also spoke with Attorney Nolan about this turmoil, and she offered me a sentence that stayed with me long afterward. "Mr. Whitfield, forgiveness and justice aren't in conflict with each other. You can forgive Tyler in your heart, for your own sake, and still insist that he face the legal consequences of what he did. Sometimes real justice is the only path that can actually help someone understand, fully and completely, the gravity of what they've done." It was with those words held close to my heart, more than any desire for vengeance, that I finally decided to move forward with full cooperation in the case against Tyler, understanding that whatever path I chose, pain for this family was already unavoidable, but determined that pain would not be meaningless, that it would carry some greater purpose for all of our futures, including Tyler's own. The trial. The trial began nearly 7 months after that first IRS letter arrived in my mailbox, held in the same Erie County courthouse where the preliminary hearing had taken place, though this time the room felt heavier, more permanent. The way any trial does, once it's clear the outcome will carry real, lasting consequences for everyone involved. A D.A. Simmons built her case methodically over 3 days of testimony, walking the jury through every piece of documentation exactly the way she'd walked me through it months earlier. The original tax filing showing accurate income data, but an altered deposit account. The bank subpoena results. The timeline of Tyler's gambling losses stretching back well over a year before that Sunday dinner conversation about handling my taxes electronically. I testified for nearly 2 hours, describing 44 years of marriage to Dorothy, 38 years of careful bookkeeping at the plant, and the particular pain of discovering that the very grandson I'd helped raise, the boy who used to sit at my kitchen table doing his own math homework while I balanced the household budget beside him, had used that same kitchen table to quietly steal from me. When ADA Simmons asked how I felt when I first understood the full scope of what had happened, I answered with words that a local paper later quoted. I spent 38 years making sure every number added up honestly. I never imagined I'd have to teach that same lesson to my own grandson, after everything, the hard way, in a courtroom. Tyler's defense attorney called a licensed addiction counselor as an expert witness, who testified at length about the compulsive, shame-driven nature of gambling addiction and how it frequently drives otherwise honest people toward increasingly desperate and secretive behavior to avoid confronting the scope of their losses. The counselor was careful to note that addiction did not excuse criminal conduct, but that understanding its role could meaningfully inform both sentencing and Tyler's path toward genuine accountability and recovery. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours before returning a verdict. I remember gripping Verna's hand in the gallery, my heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years, waiting to hear whether the truth I'd spent months documenting so carefully would finally be recognized as exactly what it was. Waiting for the jury. There is a particular kind of silence that fills a courthouse hallway while a jury deliberates, and I don't think anything in my 38 years of careful, methodical work ever quite prepared me for how long 6 hours can stretch when everything you've documented, everything you've fought for since that first letter from the IRS, hangs in the balance of 12 strangers' judgment. Verna and I sat together on a hard wooden bench outside the courtroom, drinking bad vending machine coffee that neither of us actually wanted, making the kind of small, distracted conversation people make when they're both trying not to think too hard about what's happening behind a closed door just a few feet away. Diane paced the hallway in slow, restless circles, occasionally stopping to check her phone, though there was nothing on it that could have told her anything useful about what the jury was deciding. At one point, Attorney Nolan came to sit with us, and I asked her, somewhat foolishly I suppose, whether the length of the deliberation meant anything about which way the verdict might go. She smiled gently and told me what she'd apparently told countless other anxious clients over the years. Mr. Whitfield, jury deliberation length rarely predicts the outcome the way people assume it does. Sometimes a long deliberation means they're being thorough. Sometimes it means they're divided. There's no way to know until they walk back in that room, I thought, sitting on that hard bench, about all the years I'd spent trusting numbers precisely because they gave clear, unambiguous answers, unlike people, unlike juries, unlike grandsons who could smile at you across a kitchen table while quietly stealing from you. There was something profoundly uncomfortable about surrendering control over an outcome this important to 12 people I'd never met, who had spent only 3 days getting to know the facts of a betrayal that had upended my entire family's life. When the bailiff finally called us back into the courtroom, my heart pounded harder than it had in years, and I gripped Verna's hand so tightly I worried, briefly, that I might be hurting her, though she never once let go or asked me to loosen my grip. The verdict: Tyler was found guilty of financial exploitation of an older adult under Pennsylvania law, in addition to a related federal count tied to the fraudulent tax filing that had been referred to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division and prosecuted in coordination with the state case. Given his lack of any prior criminal record, his full cooperation once confronted, and the underlying gambling addiction documented by expert testimony, Judge Whitcomb sentenced him to 2 years of probation, mandatory continued participation in a certified gambling addiction treatment program, 150 hours of community service, and full restitution of the original refund amount plus statutory interest to be paid back to me directly over a court-supervised payment schedule. When Judge Whitcomb read the sentence aloud, I didn't feel the satisfaction I might have expected to feel, sitting there after everything we'd been through. I felt instead a quiet, complicated grief. The grief of a grandfather watching his grandson formally held accountable by the state for a betrayal that had started, I believe, not from malice, but from a shame he hadn't known how to carry any other way. Tyler turned to look at me as the courtroom began to empty, and for the first time since that Thursday evening at my kitchen table, I saw something in his face that looked less like fear of consequences and more like genuine, unguarded remorse. We didn't speak that day. Attorney Nolan had advised against it, given the ongoing restitution arrangement still being finalized. But that single look told me something I needed to hold on to in the difficult months that followed. That whatever else had broken between us, some part of the boy I'd raised was still in there, finally facing what he'd done instead of hiding from it. Diane, sitting beside me, cried quietly through the entire sentencing, and afterward, in the hallway outside the courtroom, she took my hand and said the only thing either of us really needed to say in that moment. "Thank you for not letting this destroy what's left of our family, Dad. Thank you for making him face it instead of just making it disappear." Diane's own reckoning. In the months following the trial, I watched my daughter go through her own private reckoning, separate from mine, though intertwined with it in ways neither of us fully anticipated. Diane had spent her entire adult life as a nurse, someone trained to handle crisis after crisis at the hospital without flinching, and yet this particular crisis, one involving her own son, tested her composure in ways her professional training had never quite prepared her for. She started seeing a therapist about 3 months after the sentencing, something she told me about only once she felt steady enough in that process to share it openly. "Dad," she said one Sunday evening, as we sat together on the porch watching the last of the autumn light fade over Poplar Street, "I keep asking myself what I could have done differently as his mother. Should I have noticed the gambling sooner? Should I have asked him more questions when he started avoiding certain conversations about money?" I told her, as gently and as honestly as I could, that the same shame that had driven Tyler to hide his gambling from both of us had also, quite deliberately, been designed to hide itself from a mother's watchful eye. "Diane," I said, "you raised a son who knew right from wrong well enough to feel crushing shame about what he was doing. That shame is proof the values you instilled in him were real. It's proof he knew exactly how far he'd strayed from them, even while he kept straying further." She cried for a long while after I said that, and I held her the way I hadn't held her since she was a little girl, grieving not just for what Tyler had done, but for the version of motherhood she'd imagined for herself, one where her children's mistakes never grew large enough to require a criminal courtroom. Over time, Diane's therapy helped her separate her own worth as a mother from Tyler's choices as an adult, a distinction I watched her slowly, painfully learn to hold on to, even on the hardest days when guilt threatened to swallow whatever progress she'd made. Watching my daughter fight her way back to a steadier sense of herself, even while our whole family navigated the practical and emotional wreckage Tyler had left behind, became one of the quiet sources of pride that helped carry me through my own hardest months. 38 years at the plant. To understand just how deeply Tyler's betrayal cut, I have to go back much further than this past year, back to 1968. When I started as a junior clerk in the accounting office of a small manufacturing plant on the east side of Erie that made industrial fasteners, the kind of unglamorous but essential parts that hold half the machines in this country together without anyone ever noticing them. I worked my way up from junior clerk to head bookkeeper over the course of a decade, and I stayed in that same role for the next 28 years after that, watching the plant change hands twice, watching computers slowly replace the ledger books I'd learned my trade on, but never once losing the fundamental discipline that job instilled in me. Every number has to be accounted for. Every discrepancy has to be tracked down to its source. And nothing, absolutely nothing, gets written off as close enough. Dorothy used to tease me, gently, about how I approached even our household finances with the same rigor I brought to the plant's books, insisting on balancing our checkbook to the penny every single month, keeping receipts filed by category going back years further than any accountant would ever actually need them. "Harold," she'd say laughing, "the IRS isn't going to audit our grocery bill from 3 years ago. But that discipline, that refusal to let even the smallest discrepancy slide, is exactly what let me catch the fraud in my own tax refund the moment that letter arrived, instead of dismissing it as some kind of bureaucratic mix-up, the way a less careful man might have." Tyler grew up watching that same discipline, sitting at my kitchen table doing his own math homework while I went over the household budget beside him some evenings, absorbing, I always believed, the same values of honesty and careful accounting that had guided my entire working life. It's precisely because of that shared history that discovering his betrayal felt like such a profound violation, not just of my trust, but of everything I thought I'd successfully passed down to the next generation of this family. The boy I raised. I want to spend some time telling you about Tyler as a boy, before any of this happened, because understanding who he was to me makes clear just how deep this betrayal cut, deeper than any dollar amount could ever measure on its own. When Tyler's father left, Tyler was only 8 years old, and Diane, working long shifts at the hospital to keep their household afloat, needed help more than she ever wanted to admit out loud. I started picking Tyler up from school 2 or 3 afternoons a week, bringing him back to the house on Poplar Street, where Dorothy would have a snack waiting, and I'd help him with his math homework at the same kitchen table where I did my own household budgeting every month. He took to numbers early, the way I had at his age, and I remember the genuine pride I felt watching him work through long division, problems with a natural ease that reminded me of myself as a boy, though I was careful never to push him toward accounting simply because it was my own profession. When he was 12, he asked me to teach him how to balance a checkbook, an unusual request for a boy his age, and I spent an entire Saturday afternoon showing him, step by step, the same discipline I'd practiced my entire working life. "Grandpa," he told me once, maybe 14 years old at the time, sitting at that same kitchen table, "I like how numbers always add up right, if you're careful enough. People don't always make sense, but numbers do." I laughed at the time, charmed by his earnestness, never imagining that the same boy who found comfort in the honesty of numbers would one day use his understanding of exactly that system to quietly betray the person who had taught it to him. He was, in so many ways, the grandson any man would be proud to have raised alongside his own daughter, respectful, quick-witted, generous with his time toward his grandmother in her final illness. It's precisely because that boy was real, because those years of genuine connection actually happened, that discovering what he'd become capable of doing wounded me so much more deeply than a betrayal from any stranger ever could have. How I met Dorothy. I want to spend a little more time telling you about how Dorothy and I found each other, because understanding that love helps explain why losing even a piece of what we built together, all those years later, cut so much deeper than the dollar amount involved. It was a church social in the fall of 1971, one of those events where the whole point seemed to be quietly pairing off the young unmarried people of the congregation, though nobody ever said so directly. I was 22, working my 3rd year at the plant, still awkward in most social situations, more comfortable with a ledger than with small talk. Dorothy was 20, working as a receptionist at a dentist's office downtown, and she had a laugh that I remember hearing from clear across the church basement before I ever worked up the nerve to introduce myself. We took our time getting to know each other, the way people did back then, and I proposed 2 years later on the same walking path along the bay that we'd end up returning to for our anniversary almost every year of our marriage after that. We married in the spring of 1973 in the same Lutheran church my family had attended for 3 generations and moved into a small rented apartment while we saved, slowly and carefully, for the down payment on the house on Poplar Street. Dorothy managed our household finances alongside me for years before Diane was born, and even after she stopped working outside the home to raise our daughter, she stayed just as sharp about our budget as I was, the two of us sitting down together every month to go over the numbers, a partnership in the truest sense of the word. When she got sick near the end, one of the last coherent conversations we had was about making sure the finances stayed organized, that I wouldn't struggle to manage things on my own once she was gone. "You'll be fine with the money, Harold," she told me, near the very end, her voice thin, but still carrying that same steady confidence I'd fallen in love with 50 years before. "You've never once let a number get past you in your whole life." I've thought about those words more times than I can count since discovering what Tyler did, wondering, with a grief I can't quite untangle from the anger, whether she'd still believe that about me now. Dorothy's final months. I want to dedicate a little more time to Dorothy's final months, because understanding that grief helps explain, by contrast, just how deeply it hurt to discover that the very refund I'd been counting on, partly to keep up the house we'd built together, had become the object of Tyler's betrayal. The diagnosis came on a gray afternoon in early winter, 6 years ago, when a routine checkup turned up something the doctors didn't like on her chest x-ray. Emphysema, they told us, likely the result of years working in a dry cleaning shop in her 20s, before we'd even met, back when nobody thought twice about the chemicals in the air of places like that. By the time it was caught, it had already progressed further than any of us wanted to hear. In her final months, as her breathing grew more labored and her strength slowly ebbed away, Dorothy spent a good deal of her remaining energy making sure Tyler, who was 17 at the time and just beginning to think seriously about college, understood how much she believed in him. She used to have him sit with her for an hour most afternoons, listening to her stories about growing up in Erie, teaching him, in her own quiet way, the same values of honesty and hard work she'd spent her whole life living by. Harold, she told me one evening, just a few weeks before the end, her oxygen tank humming softly beside the bed. Promise me you'll keep an eye on that boy once I'm gone. He's got a good heart, but he's going to need somebody steady in his corner, especially once his father's already shown him what walking away looks like. I promised her I would, without any idea, in that moment, how literally I'd end up needing to keep that promise years later. Not by simply being present in Tyler's life, but by having to hold him accountable in the most painful way imaginable for a betrayal that struck at the exact values Dorothy had spent her final months trying to instill in him. Verna's story. I wanted to understand more fully why Verna had reacted so quickly with concern when I first told her about Tyler handling my taxes, because I sensed there was a story behind her caution, something more than just general suspicion of the younger generation. One evening, over coffee at her kitchen table, she finally told me the whole of it. Verna's late husband, Ray, had a younger brother whose son, Verna's own nephew by marriage, had, years before Ray passed, convinced an elderly aunt on the other side of the family to add him as an authorized user on her credit accounts, just to help manage the bills, he'd said, the same kind of reasonable-sounding phrase Tyler had used with me. Within 2 years, that aunt's credit had been run up to nearly the maximum across 3 different cards, all in charges the nephew later claimed were for her benefit, though the aunt herself had never authorized a single one of them. She didn't have the paperwork I had, Harold, Verna told me, her voice heavy with old grief. She didn't understand credit statements the way you understand a tax transcript. By the time anyone in the family figured out what was happening, the damage was done, and there wasn't enough of a paper trail left to make a case that would actually stick in court. She spent the last years of her life still paying down debt that was never hers to begin with, too proud and too confused to fight it properly. It was that experience, watching a family member get away with financial abuse simply because the paperwork wasn't clear enough to prosecute, that made Verna so insistent, the very first evening I mentioned Tyler's offer, that I make sure I actually understood every detail of what was being filed under my name. I couldn't watch it happen again to someone I care about, Harold, she said, not without at least trying to warn you what to look out for. Her words and her own painful history gave me a deeper appreciation for just how much luck, as much as diligence, had been on my side, luck that I happened to have the exact professional background needed to read a tax transcript with a critical eye, luck that the IRS's own systems flagged the mismatch clearly enough to send me that letter in the first place. Talking to my old supervisor, around the time I began working with Detective Kowalski, I found myself thinking often about Mr. Edward Brennan, my supervisor at the plant, for nearly 2 decades before he retired, a man who had taught me most of what I knew about careful, disciplined bookkeeping in the years before computers made so much of that work automatic. I hadn't spoken to him in almost a decade, but something about this whole ordeal made me want to hear his voice again, to tell him what had happened, and, perhaps selfishly, to hear him tell me I hadn't been foolish to trust my own grandson the way I had. I found his number through an old company directory Verna helped me track down, and when I called, he remembered me immediately, his voice as steady and measured as it had always been, even now well into his 80s. I told him the whole story, start to finish, and he listened without interrupting, the same patient way he used to listen to my reports back when I was a nervous young clerk, trying to explain a discrepancy in the quarterly figures. "Harold," he said once I'd finished, "you know better than almost anyone I ever trained that the numbers themselves never lie. People lie. Numbers just wait patiently to be read correctly. You did exactly what I always tried to teach you. You didn't panic, you didn't accuse before you had proof, and you followed the trail wherever it actually led, even when it broke your heart to see where it ended up." His words gave me a kind of comfort I hadn't expected, a validation not just of my actions during this difficult ordeal, but of an entire career's worth of discipline that had, in the end, protected me precisely when it mattered most. "You should be proud of how you handled this," he told me before we said goodbye, "even though I know pride is a strange thing to feel about something this painful. But there's no shame in having raised a grandson who eventually strayed. The shame belongs entirely to him and to the choice he made, not to you, and not to the decades of honest work that shaped the man you've always been. I hung up the phone that evening, feeling for the first time in months that the discipline of my entire working life hadn't just protected my finances, but had somehow also protected a piece of my own sense of self, exactly when Tyler's betrayal had threatened to shake it loose entirely. Other victims, Detective Kowalski. Uncovered. During his investigation, Detective Kowalski discovered that Tyler's scheme wasn't the only case of its kind his department had encountered in recent years, a fact that helped me understand just how widespread this particular vulnerability had become for older adults across the region. In one case from about 2 years earlier, an elderly veteran named Walter Doyle, living on the north side of Erie, had trusted his own niece to help him file for a property tax exemption available to disabled veterans, only to discover, nearly a year later, that she had used the personal information he'd provided to open a credit card in his name, running up several $1,000s in charges before disappearing to another state entirely. Walter, who didn't have my professional background in reading financial paperwork, hadn't noticed the fraudulent charges until a collections agency began calling his house directly, by which point his credit had been severely damaged and much of the debt was far harder to dispute. In a second case involving a woman in her 80s from the western edge of the county, a home health aide had gradually gained access to her online banking credentials under the guise of helping her pay bills, siphoning off small amounts over nearly 3 years. Amounts too small individually to trigger any bank fraud alerts, but devastating in total. By the time a suspicious family member finally noticed the woman's checking account balance had dwindled to almost nothing. What connects all these cases, Detective Kowalski told me during one of our later meetings, is the same basic vulnerability: an older adult trusting someone close to them with financial access, and the trust being exploited specifically because the victim either doesn't fully understand the paperwork involved or simply never thinks to check it carefully once it's been handed over. You caught this because of your professional background, Mr. Whitfield. Most victims aren't so fortunate. That knowledge, the awareness that my own case represented just one example of a much larger and more troubling pattern playing out across ordinary families throughout the county, strengthened my resolve to see the case through to its conclusion, even through the moments when the emotional cost of doing so felt almost unbearable. The town finds out. I never sought attention for any of this, having spent 38 years in a profession built around discretion and quiet accuracy, where nobody outside the accounting office ever needed to know the details of a company's books unless something had gone seriously wrong. But once the case went to trial, a reporter from the local paper picked up the story, and for a while, my private grief became a matter of public record in a way I hadn't fully prepared myself for. The first article ran under a headline that still gives me an odd feeling whenever I think back on it: Erie grandfather's tax refund stolen by his own grandson. Detective says case reveals wider pattern. Within a week, the story had been picked up by a regional television station, and I started receiving phone calls from reporters wanting to interview me, to put a face and a voice to what they kept calling the grandson refund scam. I turned down almost all of those requests, not out of pride, but because I felt the story belonged to more than just me. It belonged to Walter Doyle, whose case Detective Kowalski had shared with me in confidence, and to that elderly woman on the west side of the county who'd lost her savings a few dollars at a time, to a trusted home health aide, and to every other older adult across the country who might, at that very moment, be handing over their social security number and bank account information to someone they loved without ever imagining it could be used against them. I did agree to speak with one reporter, a patient woman named Sandra Whitmore, who had covered elder financial exploitation cases for years, and who wrote a longer piece focused less on me personally and more on the broader pattern, interviewing elder law attorneys, IRS, identity theft specialists, and advocacy organizations about how common this kind of family-perpetrated fraud had become, and what warning signs families should watch for. After that article ran, I started receiving letters and messages from people across the country who'd experienced something similar. A man in Ohio whose son-in-law had taken out a reverse mortgage on his house using forged signatures. A woman in Georgia whose grandson had used her identity to open several credit cards before she ever noticed a thing was wrong. I answered as many of those letters personally as I could manage, sharing the same advice I now repeat like a mantra to anyone who will listen. Never hand over your social security number or your account information without seeing the final paperwork with your own eyes before it's ever submitted, no matter how much you trust the person helping you. The letters that kept coming. In the months following Sandra Whitmore's article and the local television coverage of the case, letters and emails kept arriving more than I ever expected from a single newspaper story, each one carrying its own version of the same painful family betrayal, filtered through 100 different circumstances, but always following that same recognizable shape. One letter came from a retired schoolteacher in Scranton, describing how her son-in-law had convinced her to add him as a joint owner on her savings account, just in case anything happens to you, only for her to discover, nearly 2 years later, that he had been slowly draining that account to cover gambling debts of his own, a story so similar to mine that I had to read her letter twice to remind myself it wasn't somehow describing my own situation back to me. Another letter, this one from a retired postal worker in rural Ohio, described how his grandson had convinced him to sign over power of attorney temporarily just to help manage the bills while you recover from surgery, only for that grandson to use the authority to take out a personal loan against the man's small savings. A loan the elderly veteran hadn't discovered until collectors started calling his home directly, months after the fact. I answered as many of those letters personally as I could manage, sometimes late into the evening at my kitchen table, sharing the same advice that had become almost a second nature to me by that point. Verify everything independently. Keep detailed records of every conversation and every document, and never let gratitude for someone's help silence the small, nagging voice that tells you something doesn't quite add up. Several of those letter writers later reached out again, months afterward, to tell me that reading my story had given them the courage to finally check their own accounts more carefully. And, in at least 2 cases, that careful checking had uncovered problems they might otherwise never have caught until it was far too late. Knowing that my own painful experience had rippled outward in that way, protecting people I would never meet, gave the whole ordeal a kind of meaning I hadn't expected to find in the middle of my own grief and anger. Numbers worth sitting. With about a year after the sentencing, I was invited to speak at a community forum organized by a regional council on aging, held in a conference room at the Erie Public Library, in front of an audience of social workers, elder law attorneys, and ordinary families concerned about protecting older relatives from exactly the kind of exploitation I'd lived through. I had never been comfortable speaking in front of groups, but I accepted, believing my experience might help someone else recognize the warning signs before it was too late. Before my own remarks, a representative from a national elder justice organization presented data that left me genuinely shaken, even having already lived through my own version of what those numbers represented. She explained that financial exploitation of older adults remains one of the most underreported crimes in the country, with a significant portion of documented cases involving a family member, often an adult child or grandchild, rather than a stranger or professional scammer, precisely because family relationships create both the access and the emotional cover that make this kind of theft so difficult to detect and even harder to report once it's discovered. She also described something she called the shame gap, the tendency of both perpetrators and victims in family financial exploitation cases to hide what's happening out of shame. The perpetrator ashamed of the addiction or desperation driving their theft, and the victim ashamed of having been fooled by someone they loved and trusted completely. When it came my turn to speak, my voice shook only at the start, growing steadier as I went, and I closed with a line that a local paper later quoted in its coverage of the event. Don't let your love for someone stop you from checking the paperwork before it's submitted. And if a tax preparer or a financial professional ever calls you with a question about something that doesn't sound right, trust that call, not the reassurances of whoever is standing closest to you. After the forum, several people approached me, some to share their own family's ongoing struggles with a relative they suspected of similar behavior. Others simply to thank me for putting words to a pain so many families carry in complete isolation, hidden behind the same shame and family loyalty that had almost let Tyler's theft go undetected for good. Extended family ways. In news of Tyler's arrest didn't stay contained within our immediate household for long, and I found myself, In the weeks following the arraignment, having to field questions and reactions from a wider circle of relatives, most of whom hadn't spoken to me directly in years, some of whom I hadn't seen since Dorothy's funeral. My younger brother, Gerald, who lives out in Cleveland and with whom I've never been especially close, called me out of the blue one evening, having heard about the case from a cousin who'd seen the newspaper article shared online. "Harold," he said, his voice carrying an awkward mixture of concern and something almost like judgment. "I can't believe you're actually pursuing charges against your own grandson. Family's family. Couldn't you have just handled this quietly, kept it between yourselves?" I explained to him, as patiently as I could manage, everything that had led to this decision, the transcript, the subpoena, the pattern Detective Kowalski had uncovered across other cases in the region. But I could tell my explanation didn't fully satisfy whatever discomfort he felt about a family matter becoming a matter of public record and criminal prosecution. A cousin on Dorothy's side of the family, by contrast, wrote me a long, heartfelt letter expressing nothing but support, sharing her own story of a nephew who had exploited an elderly aunt's trust years earlier, a situation the family had chosen to handle quietly, resulting, she wrote, in that nephew going on to attempt similar schemes against two other relatives in subsequent years, since no formal consequence had ever been attached to his first betrayal. Those two very different reactions from my own extended family taught me something important about how differently people can view the same fundamental choice, whether protecting family privacy matters more than protecting the next potential victim from a pattern of behavior left unaddressed. I came to believe, more firmly with each passing month, that silence in these situations rarely protects anyone for long, and that accountability, however uncomfortable it makes distant relatives feel from the safety of a phone call, is usually the only thing standing between one betrayal and the next. A letter to Dorothy. There's a habit I've picked back up since all of this happened, one I'd let slip in the first few years of my widowhood when the grief was too heavy to find the right words for. Writing letters to Dorothy. Letters I'll never mail to any address, but that I keep folded in a small wooden box on top of her dresser, beside the framed photograph from our wedding day. In the first letter I wrote after the sentencing, I tried to tell her everything that had happened, as though she might somehow read it from wherever she is now, in that place I've always quietly believed our loved ones go, without ever making too much fuss about that belief out loud. "Dorothy," I wrote that evening, my hand a little unsteady on the page, "you asked me, near the end, to keep an eye on Tyler, to make sure he had somebody steady in his corner. I don't know if what I did counts as keeping that promise the way you meant it, but I made sure he faced the truth of what he did, out loud, in front of people who wouldn't let him talk his way around it. I hope that counts for something, even if it doesn't look the way either of us would have wanted it to look." I told her about Diane, about how our daughter had held herself together with a strength I don't think even she knew she had, and about Verna, whose steady friendship through all of this had become something I'm not sure I could have gotten through the last year without. I told her about the house on Poplar Street, still standing, the roof finally repaired now that the restitution payments had started coming in steadily, month after month, exactly as the court had ordered. I don't know if Dorothy can truly read these letters from wherever she is now, beyond whatever the eye can see, but writing them gives me a peace I haven't found anywhere else, the quiet certainty that, despite everything I've been through this past year, I haven't broken the promise I made to her in those final weeks, the promise to keep this family, imperfect and wounded as it now is, from falling apart entirely. The pressure to drop it. There's an episode I haven't mentioned yet, one that happened in the weeks between filing the police report and the preliminary hearing, when the investigation was still in a delicate early stage and family tensions had reached their most painful point. One evening, Tyler's father, Diane's ex-husband, who had remained mostly absent from Tyler's life for years, showed up unannounced at my house, having heard about the charges through Diane. "Harold," he said, his voice tight with a mix of guilt and desperation I hadn't expected from a man who'd shown so little interest in his own son over the years. "Please, drop this. He's got his whole future ahead of him. A conviction like this could follow him around for the rest of his life." I stood in my own doorway, feeling the weight of that plea press down on me, aware that behind those tears was a genuine, understandable fear for a young man's future, even from a father who had done so little to guide that future himself. "I understand your fear for him," I told him, with a steadiness that cost me more than I let show. And I want you to know that no part of me wants to see Tyler's whole life defined by this one terrible decision. But I can't withdraw a report based on documented facts, an IRS transcript, a bank subpoena, his own admission at my kitchen table. If I did, I wouldn't just be betraying the promise I made to Dorothy. I'd be teaching Tyler that theft and deception can be made to disappear if enough people cry hard enough about the consequences. I called Attorney Nolan that same evening to tell her about the visit, and she reassured me that my response had been exactly right, both legally and morally, reminding me that emotional pressure, however understandable on a human level, should never be allowed to override a decision grounded in documented, verified facts. But that night, thinking about the desperation in that man's voice, I slept worse than I had in the weeks before, aware that whatever path I chose, pain for this family had already become unavoidable. Expert voices in the courtroom. During the trial, alongside the addiction counselor who testified about gambling's compulsive grip on otherwise ordinary young people, the prosecution called an IRS, criminal investigation agent, to explain to the jury exactly how this particular kind of fraud typically unfolds. Testimony I found unexpectedly clarifying, even having lived through the crime firsthand. The agent, a methodical man named Gregory Iannuti, explained that what investigators call refund redirection fraud is especially difficult to prevent precisely because it doesn't require fabricating false income or claiming fraudulent deductions, the kinds of red flags that typically trigger automated review. Instead, it relies entirely on accurate information paired with a single altered field, the direct deposit account number, making it functionally invisible to most fraud detection algorithms, unless the actual taxpayer happens to notice the discrepancy themselves, the way I had, once the confirmation letter finally arrived. This is precisely why cases like Mr. Whitfield's are so often perpetrated by someone with close personal access to the victim's actual tax documents, Agent Iannotti told the jury, rather than by outside identity thieves working from stolen data. It requires real access to real paperwork, which in most cases means a family member, a caregiver, or someone else in a position of significant personal trust. He went on to describe, with the jury's careful attention, a handful of similar cases his division had investigated across the region in recent years, cases that almost always followed the same basic pattern: an older adult grateful for help with confusing paperwork, a younger relative or caregiver already under some form of financial pressure, and a single altered detail buried deep enough in the filing that it went unnoticed until a confirmation notice, sometimes months later, finally exposed the fraud. Listening to that testimony from the gallery, I understood, with a clarity that helped ease some of my private guilt, that my own vigilance hadn't been the only factor protecting me. The IRS's own confirmation letter, sent as a matter of routine procedure, had been the thing that finally broke through months of quiet deception. A reminder that even the most impersonal bureaucratic processes can sometimes serve as the last line of defense for people who trust too easily and too completely. My church community. Throughout this entire ordeal, I found an unexpected source of steady support from the same Lutheran congregation Dorothy and I had attended for our entire married life, the church where we'd married, where Diane had been baptized, and where, years later, we'd held Dorothy's funeral service. Pastor Daniel Reyes, who had taken over the congregation only a few years before Dorothy passed, came to visit me not long after the story became public knowledge, sitting with me at my kitchen table over coffee, listening without judgment as I explained everything that had happened. "Harold," he told me, "there's no verse in Scripture that tells you to protect a wrongdoer from the consequences of their actions in the name of family loyalty. Accountability and love aren't opposites. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to let someone's harmful choices go unaddressed." His words gave me a kind of moral clarity I hadn't fully found on my own, especially during the weeks when Tyler's father had shown up pleading with me to drop the charges, when the emotional pressure to simply let the matter disappear had felt almost overwhelming. Pastor Reyes continued checking in with me regularly throughout the investigation and the trial, sometimes simply sitting with me in the comfortable silence when words felt insufficient for what I was going through. Several members of the congregation, people I'd known for decades but never discussed anything this personal with, reached out in their own quiet ways. A casserole left on my porch, a handwritten card slipped through my mail slot, an offer to drive me to the courthouse on days when Verna had prior commitments of her own. That quiet, steady support from a community I'd been part of my entire adult life reminded me that even in the loneliest, most painful moments of a family betrayal, we rarely have to walk through it entirely alone, provided we're willing to let the people around us actually see what we're carrying. When I finally returned to regular Sunday services, several months after the sentencing, Pastor Reyes offered a prayer during the service, without naming me directly, for families finding the courage to face hard truths together. And I sat in my usual pew, the same one Dorothy and I had shared for over 4 decades, feeling, for the first time in a long while, that I wasn't navigating this grief entirely on my own. A scare of my own. There was a stretch, right in the middle of the most intense part of the investigation, when my doctor told me flatly that I needed to slow down, for my own health's sake, and that warning taught me, more than almost anything else in this whole ordeal, just how much stress this experience had placed on a body already carrying the weight of Dorothy's loss 6 years earlier. One morning in early winter, while sitting in Attorney Nolan's office going over paperwork related to the upcoming trial, I felt a sudden, sharp tightness in my chest, accompanied by a wave of dizziness that made me grip the edge of her desk to keep from sliding out of my chair. I was rushed to the emergency room at UPMC Hamont, where doctors, after a battery of tests, reassured me it hadn't been a heart attack, but rather a stress-induced cardiac episode, compounded by blood pressure that had been climbing steadily for months under the emotional weight of everything happening in my family. I spent that night, and several more in the weeks that followed, under medical observation, with Diane visiting every single day, terrified that after losing her mother 6 years earlier, she might now lose her father, too, before the case against her own son had even reached its conclusion. "You can't quit now, Dad," Diane told me one evening, holding my hand with a grip that surprised me with its strength. "We've come too far. And whatever happens with Tyler, I need you here, healthy, for whatever comes next for this family." Those words, spoken with a quiet fierceness I hadn't heard from my daughter in years, gave me a renewed determination to pace myself more carefully through the weeks that followed. With medication prescribed by my cardiologist and a guided relaxation program a counselor recommended I try, I gradually recovered over the following couple of months, though my cardiologist warned me candidly that I'd need to learn, for the rest of my life, to manage emotional stress more carefully than I ever had before, especially given my age and the grief that had already been weighing on my heart long before this whole ordeal with Tyler ever began. What the conviction cost. Tyler. I want to take a moment to be honest about the full weight of consequences Tyler faced, beyond what the court itself imposed, because understanding the complete scope of what his choices cost him helps make clear just how seriously the system and his own university ultimately treated what he'd done. Tyler's college, upon learning of the criminal charges through the local news coverage, opened its own disciplinary review under the school's honor code, since the accounting program specifically required students to maintain a clean record regarding financial integrity as a condition of remaining enrolled. After a lengthy administrative hearing, during which Tyler was represented by the same attorney handling his criminal defense, the university placed him on academic probation and required him to complete a semester-long ethics course focused specifically on financial fraud and professional responsibility before he would be permitted to continue in the accounting program at all. Several of his professors, Diane told me, were aware of the case, and while none of them treated him with open hostility, the atmosphere in his major coursework became, understandably, more strained than it had ever been before. One professor, a woman who taught a course on forensic accounting, apparently used an anonymized version of certain elements from Tyler's own case as a discussion topic in her class, without naming him directly, though Tyler recognized the details immediately and told his mother it had been one of the most humbling experiences of the entire ordeal, sitting silently through a classroom discussion of the exact kind of fraud he himself had committed. Financially, the restitution payments, on top of legal fees his family had to help cover, meant Tyler graduated with considerably more debt than he'd originally anticipated, delaying his own plans to pursue a CPA license by at least 2 additional years while he worked to stabilize his finances. It was, in its own way, a kind of poetic consequence, A young man who had stolen from his grandfather through the exploitation of tax paperwork now found his own professional path in accounting delayed and complicated by the financial and reputational fallout of that very crime. I won't pretend I take any satisfaction in watching Tyler's academic and professional path become so much harder because of his own choices. But I do believe, having watched this unfold, that consequences proportional to the harm caused are a necessary part of any real path toward change, and that a young man who skips past those consequences too easily rarely learns the lesson deeply enough to avoid repeating some version of the same mistake later in life. Tyler's path forward. About a year after the sentencing, once Tyler had completed the first phase of his court-mandated gambling addiction treatment program, he asked, through Diane, whether I'd be willing to meet him for coffee, somewhere neutral, away from the house on Poplar Street, and away from any legal proceedings still hanging over both our heads. I agreed, though not without a good deal of soul-searching first, talking it through carefully with both Verna and Attorney Nolan before deciding I was ready. I found him changed in ways that surprised me, thinner, quieter, with none of the easy confidence he'd carried that Sunday evening at my kitchen table, but with something else in its place that looked cautiously like genuine humility. "Grandpa," he said, his voice careful, "I know there's nothing I can say that makes what I did okay. I'm not here to ask you to forget it or pretend it didn't happen. I just wanted you to know that I'm in the program. I've been going to meetings twice a week, and for the first time in almost 2 years, I haven't placed a single bet. I know that doesn't undo anything. I just wanted you to hear it from me." I sat with that for a long moment, studying the young man across from me, remembering the boy who used to sit at my kitchen table, doing his own homework while I balanced the family budget beside him. "Tyler," I said finally, "I believe that you mean that today. What I need to see, over time, not just words, is whether that commitment holds when things get hard again. Because addiction doesn't disappear just because someone finally says the right things out loud." I told him, as honestly as I could, that whatever relationship we managed to rebuild, if any, would depend entirely on years of consistent, demonstrated honesty, not on a single tearful conversation over coffee, no matter how sincere it felt in the moment. He nodded, accepting that condition without argument, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I allowed myself a small, cautious hope that some version of my grandson, the one Dorothy had spent her final months trying to shape, might still find his way back to the values she'd worked so hard to instill in him. An unsettling precedent. During the deeper stages of Detective Kowalski's investigation, a detail surfaced that added another uncomfortable layer to this whole story, suggesting Tyler's troubles with money and honesty went back further than either Diane or I had ever realized. Detective Kowalski, with the proper authorization from the district attorney's office, uncovered that, roughly 3 years earlier, while Dorothy was still alive but already quite ill, Tyler had asked her directly for a loan of several $100s, claiming he needed it to cover an unexpected car repair so he could keep driving to his part-time job. Dorothy, in the quiet generosity that defined her whole life, had given it to him without hesitation, and, according to a note investigators found among her old papers, had never asked him to repay it, apparently sensing even then that something about the request hadn't fully added up. "We don't have enough to establish with certainty exactly when your grandson's difficulties with money first began," Detective Kowalski told me. "But this earlier loan suggests a pattern that likely started developing gradually, well before the tax refund incident you eventually discovered. That discovery affected me more deeply than I expected, because it meant that Dorothy, with the same quiet intuition that had guided her through 50 years of marriage, had likely already sensed that something wasn't right in Tyler's life, without ever having the time or the strength in those final difficult months to pursue that concern any further. I reached out as gently as I could manage to Tyler himself to share this discovery, not to pile on additional shame, but to help him understand just how long his financial struggles had been, quietly eroding the family's trust, well before I myself ever became fully aware of the danger. Tyler broke down when I told him about that old loan from his grandmother, admitting he'd never fully grasped just how much time had passed since his own judgment had first begun slipping, one small compromise at a time, until it led him to a kitchen table and a tax return he never should have touched. The seasons on Poplar Street. There are moments in these quiet evenings over the past year when I simply sit on my front porch and watch the light change over Poplar Street, thinking about how many seasons I've watched pass from this exact spot, how many eerie winters have buried this street in lake-effect snow, how many summers have brought that same thick, humid heat rolling off Lake Erie that Dorothy always complained about, but secretly loved. Fall, in particular, remains my favorite season in this city, with the maples along the street turning that deep, almost violent red before the leaves finally let go, and the air carrying that particular chill off the lake that tells you winter isn't far behind. It was on one of those crisp fall evenings, almost exactly a year after the sentencing, that I found myself walking along the lakefront path with Verna, the same path Dorothy and I used to walk decades earlier when I ran into Detective Kowalski, off duty that evening, out walking with his own family along the same stretch of shoreline. We stopped to talk for a few minutes, more like old acquaintances now than victim and investigating officer on a closed case, and he said something that has stayed with me since. "Mr. Whitfield," he told me, "in 20 years on the force, I've seen a lot of family fraud cases, but I don't see many people handle it with the kind of steady, methodical dignity you brought to this one, treating it like a set of facts to be documented and verified, instead of letting rage or shame take over. That says a great deal about who you actually are, far more than your grandson ever understood when he assumed you'd never notice what he'd done." His words stayed with me the rest of that walk home, as I thought about how much my life had changed since the beginning of this ordeal, and how, despite the pain still present from Tyler's betrayal, I felt, in some fundamental way, stronger than before, more aware of the real value of what Dorothy and I had built together across a lifetime of careful, honest work. An old bookkeeper's advice. If there's one thing I'd want every person my age, every grandparent handing over paperwork to a younger relative out of gratitude for their help, to take away from this story, it's this: never let anyone submit anything with your social security number or your bank account information on it without seeing the final version with your own two eyes first. For 38 years, I taught myself that every single number needs to be verified before it gets entered into the permanent record, and yet I let that discipline slip the one time it mattered most, in my own kitchen, with my own grandson, simply because gratitude and love made me want to trust him completely. I've also learned that real family isn't measured only by blood, but by who actually shows up to protect you when it matters most. Verna wasn't my relative, and yet she was the first person to raise a concern, recognizing in Tyler's offer the same pattern that had devastated someone she loved years earlier. Tyler was my own grandson, raised at my own kitchen table, and yet he chose, when desperation came calling, to exploit the very trust I'd given him so freely. That contrast has taught me to look past the formal ties of family toward the people who actually demonstrate, through their concrete actions, that they deserve renewed trust. And finally, I've learned that recognizing an addiction in a family member, however painful the criminal consequences that follow from it, doesn't have to mean condemning that person completely as a human being. Tyler committed a serious crime against me, one I won't ever fully forget. But he also deserves, like anyone struggling with a genuine addiction, the chance to recover, provided that recovery moves forward alongside full accountability, not as a substitute for it. Holding both of those truths at once, the seriousness of what he did, and his continued worth as a human being capable of change, has been the hardest and most necessary lesson of this entire ordeal. Walter and I. In the time since the trial concluded, my friendship with Walter Doyle, a veteran whose own case Detective Kowalski had shared with me, and who later testified at Tyler's trial, has grown into something I hadn't expected to find at this stage of my life. A genuine kinship, built on shared understanding of a very particular kind of grief. We meet most weeks now at a small diner near the lakefront. Two old men comparing notes on a betrayal that neither of us ever imagined we'd have in common. Walter, unlike me, never received a dime of restitution. His niece had crossed state lines before charges could be filed, and the case against her eventually stalled out in a tangle of jurisdictional complications that left him with nothing but the damaged credit history and a bitterness he's still working to set down. "You got what I never did, Harold," he told me once over coffee, without any resentment in his voice, only a kind of tired honesty. A full trial, a jury that actually heard the whole truth, restitution ordered by an actual judge. I got a case file that eventually got marked inactive because nobody could find her anymore. I've tried, in whatever small ways I can, to help Walter advocate for himself, with the credit bureaus still holding old fraudulent charges against his name. Using what little knowledge I've accumulated from my own case to help him push back against errors that have lingered on his credit report for years now. Together, we started attending the same community forums and elder advocacy meetings, sharing our two different outcomes from what was, at its core, the exact same crime, hoping that hearing both versions, mine, which reached a real resolution, and his, which never did, might help other families understand both what's possible when the system works as it should, and how badly it can fail those who don't have quite the same fortunate combination of circumstances I happen to have. Walter has become, in his own quiet way, another piece of the unexpected community this whole ordeal built around me, alongside Verna, alongside Pastor Reyes, alongside Detective Kowalski himself. All of us bound together now by a shared commitment to making sure fewer families have to walk this particular road entirely alone. Poplar Street, today. I'm writing this part of the story on a cold evening, almost 2 years now, since that first IRS letter appeared in my mailbox. The house on Poplar Street is still mine. The roof finally repaired now that Tyler's court-ordered restitution payments have been arriving steadily, month after month, exactly as the judge specified. I'm 76 years old now, and my hands, marked by decades of careful bookkeeping, shake a little more than they used to when I sit down each month to reconcile my own accounts, a habit I've kept up with even more rigorously since all of this happened. My eyes, though, remain sharp enough to catch a discrepancy in a bank statement, sharp enough to recognize, with the painful clarity of hard experience, the subtle warning signs of a family betrayal before it can grow into something even more devastating. Tyler has completed his community service hours and continues attending his gambling addiction support meetings twice weekly, according to what Diane tells me during her regular visits. He hasn't yet asked to come back to Poplar Street on a regular basis, and I haven't yet invited him to, though we've had 2 more coffee meetings since that first one, each a little easier than the last, each still carrying the careful, watchful distance I know will take years, not months, to fully close. Diane comes by every Sunday now, sometimes alone, sometimes with a friend, continuing the traditions Dorothy started decades ago of a family dinner at the end of each week, though the table feels different now, quieter in ways that have nothing to do with the number of chairs filled around it. Verna still joins me for our evening walks along Poplar Street most nights the weather allows, and in certain quiet moments, watching her laugh at something on the local news, or listening to her share stories about her own grandchildren, I've come to realize that the loneliness I feared after Dorothy passed has become, without my quite noticing when it happened, a little lighter than it once was. Not replaced by what I lost, but eased by an unexpected friendship built on the same honesty and trust that this whole ordeal taught me never to take for granted again. The old ledger book. There was a project, during the hardest months of this whole ordeal, that gave me a kind of comfort I hadn't expected to find. Restoring an old ledger book from the plant, one my former supervisor had given me as a keepsake when I retired. Its leather cover cracked with age, its pages brittle after decades sitting in a box in my attic. I took up that project in the weeks right after the investigation began, almost as a way to keep my hands occupied, while my mind wrestled with something too painful to face head-on for very long at a time. I spent evenings carefully cleaning the leather cover with the same gentle products I remembered a bookbinder friend once recommending, reinforcing the loosened binding thread by thread, protecting each fragile page with an archival sleeve, working with the same patient precision I'd once applied to balancing the company's actual monthly figures decades earlier. There was something deeply symbolic, I realized only toward the end of that project, in devoting myself to restoring something old and neglected, precisely while my own family life seemed to be falling apart around me. Every stitch I carefully repaired, every page I gently reinforced, gave me back a small piece of the control and dignity that Tyler's betrayal had so thoroughly shaken. When I finally finished restoring that ledger, after weeks of careful, patient work, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in longer than I could remember. A satisfaction that reminded me exactly why I devoted 38 years of my life to this work in the first place. Not for the money, and certainly not for any recognition, but for the deep, quiet satisfaction of restoring order and accuracy to something that mattered. Today, that ledger sits on a small shelf in my study, right next to a framed photograph of Dorothy, and every time I look at it, I think about how patience and careful attention can restore dignity even to what seemed hopelessly lost. Exactly the way that same patience and attention eventually restored the truth about my stolen refund, protected by the very kind of meticulous documentation I'd spent a lifetime learning to respect. A portrait of an old bookkeeper. A few months ago, a young photographer from the community college in Erie, a student named Marcus Delaney, who had heard my story through a mutual friend and was himself working through the aftermath of an uncle's financial betrayal involving a small family inheritance, asked if he could photograph me and the objects that mattered most from my life as part of a photography project on resilience within families. He spent several weeks photographing me at different times of day, reading on the front porch as the morning light came through the maples, sitting at my kitchen table going over my monthly bank statement with the same careful attention I'd applied for decades, standing beside the restored ledger book in my study, the framed photograph of Dorothy visible just behind my shoulder in several of the shots. When he showed me the finished collection during a small gathering he arranged with Verna and Diane present, I found myself unexpectedly moved. The photographs told a story without a single word of narration, a life built on careful attention to detail, tested by a betrayal that could have broken that discipline entirely, but instead had only deepened my commitment to it. I wanted to capture more than just you, Marcus told me, handing over a printed copy of the collection. I wanted to capture the idea that paying close attention to the details of our lives isn't just a habit, it's a form of protection, and sometimes even a form of love for the people who come after us. Those photographs now hang in a small frame in my front hallway, the first thing any visitor sees when they walk through my door, a quiet, permanent reminder of what patient honesty can accomplish even in the face of the most painful betrayal by someone we trusted completely. Marcus told me he'd wanted to create this project, not just for me, but for every family in the area, quietly carrying the weight of a similar betrayal, hidden behind pride and the shame of admitting that someone they loved had chosen to deceive them, a shame that too often keeps these stories buried instead of shared as warnings that might protect the next family from the same painful discovery. The first Thanksgiving after the truth. The first Thanksgiving after the trial concluded carried a mixture of feelings for our whole family. The first holiday we could finally sit with the truth of what had happened out in the open, without the weight of an unresolved investigation still hanging over every conversation. In the days leading up to the holiday, I found myself going through the box of decorations Dorothy had always kept, carefully organized in the hall closet, each ornament and table setting carrying its own small memory. She used to love recounting every single year. The ceramic turkey Tyler made in kindergarten, still displayed proudly on the sideboard every November since. The tablecloth we'd bought on our honeymoon that Dorothy insisted on using for every major holiday, no matter how careful she had to be washing out the occasional stain. I hosted dinner at the house on Poplar Street, exactly as Dorothy always had, inviting Diane, Verna, who I'd come to consider practically part of the family by that point, and Detective Kowalski, along with his own wife and children, as a small gesture of gratitude for the diligence that had made this whole difficult process of accountability possible in the first place. Tyler wasn't at that first Thanksgiving. We all agreed, without much discussion, that it was still too soon. But Diane brought a card from him, a short handwritten note thanking me for not giving up on him, even while holding him fully accountable. I read it quietly to myself before dinner, then placed it carefully in the same wooden box where I keep my letters to Dorothy, a small but real sign of the slow, uncertain progress this family was still working to make. During dinner, I raised a glass in Dorothy's memory, thanking her silently for the patience and honesty she had instilled in this family across decades, values that had ultimately protected us, even through the most painful betrayal any of us could have imagined coming from someone we loved so completely. Diane, sitting beside me, squeezed my hand under the table in a quiet, wordless gesture of gratitude and shared grief. And for the first time in over a year, I felt something close to genuine peace settle over that table, despite the empty chair we all still noticed, in our own separate ways, throughout the meal. Getting the refund back, one of the more frustrating parts of this whole ordeal, in a strange way, wasn't the criminal case itself, but the separate, painstakingly slow process of actually getting my original refund reissued by the IRS, a process that ran on its own bureaucratic timeline almost entirely independent from the criminal proceedings against Tyler. After filing Form 14039, the identity theft affidavit, along with copies of the police report and supporting documentation from Attorney Nolan's office, I was assigned a caseworker within the IRS's Identity Theft Victim Assistance Unit, a woman named Carla Jennings, who called me periodically over the following months to update me on the case's progress, always careful to explain that identity theft cases involving fraudulent refund redirection typically take considerably longer to resolve than ordinary tax disputes, given the additional verification steps required to confirm the taxpayer's true identity and reissue funds safely. Mr. Whitfield, she told me during one particularly frustrating call nearly 8 months after I'd first reported the fraud, I understand how difficult this waiting period can feel, especially once you already know exactly what happened and who was responsible. But our verification process exists precisely to prevent a second layer of fraud, ensuring the reissued refund actually goes to the legitimate taxpayer and not to any other unauthorized party. It ultimately took just over 11 months from my initial report for the IRS to fully verify my case and reissue the original refund amount directly into my actual bank account at First Erie Community Bank, a process that ran on a timeline entirely separate from Tyler's own court-ordered restitution payments, which had already begun arriving steadily by that point under Judge Whitcomb's supervision. When that reissued refund finally appeared in my account, I sat at my kitchen table for a long while, staring at the confirmation on my banking app, feeling a strange, quiet relief that had less to do with the actual dollar amount, and more to do with the simple fact that the system, slow and frustrating as it had been, had ultimately worked exactly the way it was supposed to, restoring what had been unlawfully taken, provided I had the patience and the documentation necessary to see the process through to its conclusion. Voices in the courtroom. During the trial, alongside the addiction counselor and the IRS criminal investigation agent, the prosecution also called Walter Doyle himself, the elderly veteran whose case Detective Kowalski had shared with me in confidence months earlier to testify about his own experience with financial exploitation at the hands of a trusted family member, offering the jury a broader context for understanding just how systematic and damaging this kind of family-perpetrated fraud can become. Walter, now in his early 80s and walking with the careful assistance of a cane, described to the jury how his niece had used his personal information to open a credit card in his name, running up debt that took him years to fully untangle from his own credit history. Debt that, unlike my own case, was never fully compensated through any court-ordered restitution, since his niece had disappeared out of state before charges could ever be formally filed against her. "I want you to understand something," Walter told the jury, his voice steady despite his obvious age and the visible effort it cost him to speak at length. Mr. Whitfield here was fortunate. He had the professional background to catch what happened to him, and he had a police department willing to actually pursue the case with everything they had. I didn't have either of those things, and to this day, my credit still carries scars from what my niece did to me. What happened to Mr. Whitfield is the same crime that happened to me. He just had the tools and the support to actually fight back. Hearing Walter's testimony from the gallery, I felt a complicated mixture of gratitude and grief. Gratitude for the systems and support that had allowed my own case to reach a real resolution, and grief for a man sitting just a few rows away from me who had never received the same measure of justice for an identical betrayal. After the trial concluded, Walter and I struck up a quiet friendship of our own, meeting occasionally for coffee, two men who had lived through nearly the same kind of family betrayal, but with very different outcomes, united now by a shared determination to speak publicly about a pattern of exploitation that too many older adults across the country continue to face in complete isolation. Emily understands. I haven't yet mentioned that Tyler has a younger sister, Emily, who was 19 at the time all of this unfolded, away at college a few hours from Erie, and who had to absorb the news of her older brother's arrest, largely through phone calls with her mother, unable to be physically present for much of the early investigation and the preliminary hearing. When Emily came home for winter break that first year, She asked to speak with me privately, sitting across from me at the same kitchen table where Tyler had once filed that fraudulent return. "Grandpa," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of anger and grief that surprised me with its intensity, "I don't understand how he could do this to you. You're the one who taught both of us how to balance a checkbook. You're the one who paid for half my textbooks freshman year without even being asked. How could he look at everything you've done for this family and decide to steal from you?" I told her honestly that I didn't have a complete answer, that addiction and shame together can push even people who love us toward decisions that seem incomprehensible from the outside, but that this didn't erase the real harm caused, nor did it mean Tyler deserved to be defined forever by this one devastating choice. "I'm not asking you to forgive him right away, Emily," I told her, "and you don't owe him that forgiveness on anyone else's timeline but your own. But I hope, over time, you'll be able to see him as someone capable of genuine change, the same way I'm trying to hold on to that hope myself, even while I make sure he faces the full weight of what he did." Emily nodded, wiping away tears, and told me she planned to study finance in her remaining years of college. Partly, she admitted, because watching this entire ordeal unfold had made her want to understand exactly how these kinds of financial systems work, so that she'd never be caught unaware the way I nearly was, and so that she might one day help other families recognize the warning signs before a similar betrayal could ever take root in their own homes. The bank's response. A few months after the trial concluded, I received a call from a regional manager at First Erie Community Bank, the institution where I'd banked for over 40 years, asking if I'd be willing to consult, informally, on new procedures they were developing to help protect elderly customers from exactly the kind of financial exploitation I'd experienced, even though the fraud itself had technically occurred through the IRS filing system rather than directly through my own bank. Mr. Whitfield, the manager, a woman named Patricia Alvarez, told me during our first meeting, "Your case brought up an important gap in how we communicate with our older customers about protecting their account information more broadly, even when the actual point of compromise happens outside our own systems. We want to develop clearer guidance for customers like yourself, and frankly, we could use your perspective, given your professional background." Over the following weeks, I worked with the bank's customer service team to help draft a simple plain language brochure explaining the risks of sharing account and routing numbers with family members for tax preparation or other financial purposes, along with a checklist of steps customers could take to verify any transaction before it was finalized, rather than after the fact. Once the money had already moved somewhere, it shouldn't have gone. That brochure, I later learned, was distributed to every branch across the regional bank's network, and Patricia told me it had already prompted several customers to ask more detailed questions before authorizing family members to handle sensitive financial paperwork on their behalf. Knowing that my own painful experience had contributed in some small but concrete way to protecting other customers going forward gave me a sense of purpose that helped balance out some of the lingering grief from everything Tyler's betrayal had cost our family. "You turned something painful into something genuinely useful for a lot of people who'll never even know your name," Patricia told me at the end of our final working session together. "And that's not something everyone manages to do after going through what you went through." Community service. As part of his sentence, Tyler was required to complete 150 hours of community service, and the court, taking into account both his academic background in accounting and the nature of his offense, assigned him to volunteer with a local nonprofit that helps low-income and elderly residents of Erie County file their tax returns free of charge each spring, working under close supervision of licensed volunteer coordinators. Diane told me, during one of our regular Sunday visits, that Tyler had approached this assignment with a seriousness that surprised even her, arriving early to every shift, staying late to help finish paperwork for clients who needed extra time and patience, treating every single form with a level of careful attention that, in a strange and painful irony, mirrored the exact kind of diligence he'd deliberately abandoned when he altered my own tax return months earlier. "He told me once," Diane said, her voice quiet, "that every time he helps an elderly client file their return correctly, he thinks about you and about what he took from you, and it keeps him honest in a way that nothing else quite manages to do." I didn't know, hearing that, whether to feel comforted or simply sad, imagining my own grandson using the memory of his betrayal as a kind of daily penance, a discipline he'd apparently needed all along, but had never found until the criminal justice system forced it upon him. I asked Diane cautiously whether she thought this assignment was genuinely helping him, or whether it was simply another performance meant to demonstrate remorse to a judge and a probation officer. "I think it started that way," she admitted honestly, "as something he had to do to satisfy the court. But somewhere along the way, I think it became something he actually needed, a way of proving to himself, more than to anyone watching, that he could still be the kind of person who helps rather than harms." I've thought about her words often since that conversation, wondering whether genuine change can grow out of a punishment that begins as pure obligation, and whether, given enough time and enough consistency, that kind of forced accountability might eventually become something closer to real, lasting character. What I've learned. Looking back on everything I've been through, from that first Sunday dinner conversation about handling my taxes electronically to this evening, sitting here with the restored ledger book resting on its shelf across the room, there are a few simple truths I now carry more deeply than any accounting principle I ever learned across 38 years of professional practice. The first is that no financial arrangement, however reasonable and well-intentioned it might sound, should ever be accepted without a full, careful review of the actual paperwork involved. I handed Tyler my social security number and my bank account information out of nothing but love and gratitude, without ever once looking at the actual return before it was filed. And that single lapse in a lifetime of otherwise careful attention very nearly cost me not just money, but a piece of the trust that had defined my entire family. The second truth is that official documentation, a tax transcript, a bank subpoena, a carefully kept legal pad of notes, carries a weight that emotional reassurance simply cannot match. It was the IRS's own confirmation letter, followed by the transcript I requested and carefully studied, that ultimately exposed a truth Tyler had hoped would stay hidden indefinitely behind a wall of casual, confident reassurance. The third truth, perhaps the hardest one to accept, is that the deepest betrayals rarely come from strangers. They come from the people who've sat at our own kitchen tables for years, who call us grandpa with the same voice they use to quietly exploit the trust we've given them without reservation. And finally, the fourth truth, maybe the most important of all: justice, however slow and however painful its process might feel, can eventually arrive, provided we have the courage to verify what our instincts are telling us instead of accepting comforting reassurances at face value, provided we find at least one person willing to believe us when everyone else might prefer the easier path of looking away, and provided we hold on to the same careful, patient documentation that protected the truth of this whole story from being lost. Exactly the same discipline I spent 38 years applying to numbers that, until this past year, I never imagined I'd need to apply to my own family. The weeks before. Before I bring this story to its final conclusions, I want to return, one more time, to the weeks leading up to that Sunday dinner conversation about handling my taxes electronically, because there's a detail I've saved for the end, one that still gives me a small chill whenever I think back on it now. In the weeks before that conversation, Tyler had started visiting more often than usual, asking careful questions about my exact income sources, whether I still did any part-time consulting work, whether my pension arrived by direct deposit or by check, questions that at the time I interpreted as ordinary grandsonly curiosity, the kind of casual interest a college student studying accounting might naturally take in an older relative's financial life. Looking back now, with the clarity that only comes after the fact, I recognize those conversations for what they likely were: careful reconnaissance, gathering exactly the information he'd need to make his eventual offer to handle my taxes sound not just helpful, but almost inevitable, a natural extension of an interest he'd already been quietly cultivating for weeks. I think often about how thin the line is between genuine affection and calculated manipulation, how similar they can look from the outside, especially when the person involved continues to show every other sign of authentic care in the majority of their daily interactions with us. There's no simple formula for telling the difference, no single foolproof signal that guarantees certainty. There's only constant attention to detail, the willingness to never assume that apparent kindness automatically rules out hidden, troubling motives, and above all, the wisdom to always verify significant financial paperwork independently before accepting it as final, no matter how much we trust the person who prepared it. Those weeks, the last ones before the betrayal took full shape, I lived through with an ordinary, unsuspecting calm that hid, without my awareness, the quiet planning already taking place beneath the surface. A plan that would only reveal its true nature months later through a single letter from the IRS. A word for anyone doubting themselves. I want to spend one more moment speaking directly to anyone listening to this story who recognizes in their own life that same painful feeling of having handed over something important without fully checking it, of feeling foolish now for trusting someone who turned out to be willing to betray that trust. In the weeks after I first discovered what Tyler had done, I asked myself over and over whether I was somehow to blame for this, for not double-checking the return before it was filed, for trusting my own grandson so completely that I never thought to verify a single detail. That guilt, I've come to understand over time, is understandable but ultimately misplaced. The responsibility for a betrayal always belongs to the person who commits it, not to the person who, in good faith, extended trust to someone who should have deserved it. But there's a valuable lesson buried in all of this too, one I want to share with anyone facing a similar situation. Even when trust is betrayed, not everything is lost if we have the determination to verify the facts carefully, the same discipline we'd apply to any other important area of our lives. My own professional background, which hadn't protected me at the moment I handed over my paperwork, became exactly the tool that let me read that IRS transcript with a critical, careful eye once the confirmation letter finally arrived. The message I'd want to leave with anyone facing a similar offer from a family member, someone eager to handle your taxes, your banking, your social security information to make things easier, is this: never be afraid to ask detailed questions. Never be afraid to see the actual paperwork with your own eyes before it's ever submitted. And never let gratitude for someone's help stop you from double-checking exactly what they've done with your most sensitive personal information. Your financial security, the product of a lifetime of careful, honest work, deserves exactly that same level of careful attention, no matter how much you trust the person offering to help. One last image. I close my eyes sometimes, in the evenings, and I still see that Tuesday afternoon standing at my own mailbox, the IRS letter shaking slightly in my hands, the cold, creeping confusion of realizing that money I'd been counting on had vanished into an account that wasn't mine. I see Verna's face that first evening on our walk, the quiet concern in her eyes before either of us fully understood what we were dealing with. I see Attorney Nolan's office, the folder of instructions she handed me, the careful way she explained the difference between an ordinary family misunderstanding and a documented pattern of financial exploitation. I see Detective Kowalski's steady, patient manner as he walked me through each stage of an investigation that must have felt, to him, like just another case file, but that felt to me like the unraveling of everything I thought I understood about my own family. I see the moment I sat down with that transcript for the first time, tracing the numbers with my finger the way I used to trace a column of figures at the plant, feeling that same cold certainty settle over me as the routing and account numbers refused to match anything I recognized. And I see most of all the moment Tyler sat across from me at my own kitchen table, the same table where he'd once filed that fraudulent return, finally telling me the truth I'd already suspected but had hoped against all reason might somehow not be true. It was in that exact moment, I believe, that I stopped being a man paralyzed by disbelief in his own grandson and became once again the bookkeeper who'd spent 38 years learning to trust careful documentation over comfortable assumptions, a man capable of verifying his rights, of protecting with the same patient discipline I'd applied to a lifetime of ledgers, the dignity and the savings I'd built together with my wife. The restored ledger book still sits on its shelf in my study, a quiet, permanent reminder of what patient attention and the refusal to give up can accomplish, even in the face of the most painful betrayal from someone we love completely. If there's one lesson I hope you carry away from everything I've shared with you today, it's this: never let your age or your love for someone become an excuse for skipping the careful verification that protects everything you've worked your whole life to build. one last thought for you. If you've made it this far, listening to my story all the way through, I want to leave you with something more than just the account of what happened. I want to leave you with a question, the same question I've asked myself every single night since this whole ordeal began. Are you certain that your own financial information, your social security number, your bank account details, are protected in a way that would survive a betrayal from the person you trust most in this world? I'm not asking you to suspect everyone you love, nor am I asking you to turn every family arrangement into a forensic investigation, devoid of any trust in the people around you. I'm simply asking you to never let your trust in someone stop you from verifying, through appropriate and proportionate means, exactly what your instincts are telling you. And if someone close to you shows signs of a hidden struggle, a gambling problem, a financial desperation they haven't confessed to anyone, don't wait for that desperation to push them toward choices that could permanently damage your family's trust. Talk about it openly before it's too late. Faith, for me, has never been about grand gestures or long, formal prayers, but about small daily acts of attention and gratitude. Gratitude toward Dorothy, who taught me the value of careful, patient diligence applied to every part of our shared life together. Trust in Verna, who believed me from the very first moment, recognizing in Tyler's offer the same pattern that had devastated someone she loved years before, and the quiet hope, which I still carry today, that justice can always coexist with compassion, even when the betrayal comes from someone who should have loved us more. If this story has moved you, if it's reminded you of someone you know, an elderly parent or grandparent handling their taxes with the help of a younger relative, a family member who might be hiding a financial struggle of their own, I ask only this: talk to them this week. Ask if every important document has actually been reviewed with their own eyes before it's ever submitted. And if someone offers to take care of everything regarding their finances with a little too much reassurance and a little too much urgency, encourage them to pause and verify before signing away anything at all. Before we say goodbye, I'm writing these final words sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where Tyler once filed that fraudulent return, with the restored ledger book resting on its shelf across the room, and the photograph of Dorothy watching over everything from its place on my dresser down the hall. I've thought a great deal these past 2 years about how fortunate I was compared to other victims of similar schemes. People like Walter Doyle, whose case never reached the same resolution mine did, or the countless others who wrote to me after that newspaper article ran, sharing stories that never made it to any courtroom at all. I had a professional background that let me read a tax transcript with a critical eye, a friend who recognized the warning signs from painful personal experience, an attorney who understood exactly which statutes applied, and a detective determined to see the case through to its conclusion. Not everyone has that same combination of good fortune, and that is exactly why I chose to share this story publicly, instead of keeping it as a private family matter, protected behind a more comfortable silence. But comfort, I've learned, was never really the guiding star of my life, any more than it was for Dorothy before me. We built this life one carefully balanced ledger at a time, one honestly earned dollar at a time, one carefully protected right at a time, first together, and now, perhaps one day with Emily, who's studying finance partly because of everything our family lived through, determined to understand these systems well enough to protect herself, and maybe others, from ever facing what I've faced. If sharing this story helps even one person, in one family, trust their own instincts instead of letting comforting reassurances talk them out of double-checking something important, then every word I've shared here will have meant something far greater than I, a simple retired bookkeeper from Erie, Pennsylvania, could ever have imagined when I first sat down to write it. Before you go, if this story touched your heart the way living through it touched mine, I'm going to ask you for one small favor before you close this video. Share this story with someone you know, an older parent or grandparent who lets a younger relative handle their taxes or their banking, anyone who hasn't yet learned to double-check important paperwork before it's ever submitted on their behalf. And if this isn't the first story you've heard on this channel, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. True stories of dignity, justice, and courage, told with exactly the respect they deserve. And leave me a comment. Tell me where you listened from. Tell me what you thought, and tell me if you too, near or far, have known a story like this one. Maybe a family member who handled something important for you and didn't tell you the whole truth, or an official letter that arrived at exactly the right moment to reveal something nobody wanted you to find out. Before I let you go, one last word. Some details in this story have been fictionalized for the sake of clarity and emotional weight. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental, but the lesson you just heard, the one about always verifying what someone you trust has done with your most important information, that part is as real as it gets, as real as the columns I balanced by hand for 38 years of my working life. Thank you for staying with me until the very end.